When I asked my father for a raise, I chose my words carefully. I had learned over the years that tone mattered more than truth with him. Too confident sounded entitled. Too emotional sounded weak. So I stood in his office, hands loosely folded, and spoke the way I always did when I wanted to be heard. Calm, respectful, controlled. I explained how my role had changed, how it had grown without ever being officially acknowledged. I reminded him that I wasn't asking for anything sudden or unreasonable, just recognition that my work was no longer what it had been years ago. He listened without interrupting. That should have reassured me. It didn't. His office looked exactly the same as it always had. The heavy desk. The framed awards on the wall, all with his name engraved beneath them. Photos from events I had organized but never attended properly because I was always working behind the scenes. I had spent more hours in that room than I could count. Yet standing there now, I felt like a visitor asking for permission. When I finished speaking, there was a brief silence. Then he leaned back in his chair. He smiled. Not warmly, not proudly, but comfortably. The smile of someone who felt secure. "You should be grateful," he said. "You're lucky to even have a job like this." The word lucky didn't sound cruel when he said it. That was the problem. It sounded reasonable. Almost generous. For a moment I couldn't speak. Lucky didn't explain the nights I stayed after everyone else had gone home. Lucky didn't explain the weekends spent in the office fixing problems that weren't supposed to exist. Lucky didn't explain the calls I answered when suppliers backed out, or the meetings I handled when clients were ready to walk away. I tried to remind him. I mentioned the year our biggest client nearly left. How I had met them privately, promised solutions I then stayed up nights creating. I mentioned the system failure that almost shut operations down. The one I rebuilt quietly so no one outside ever knew how close we came to disaster. He waved his hand gently, as if brushing dust from the air. "That's part of learning," he said. "Family businesses don't work like normal companies. Loyalty matters more than money." The sentence landed softly. The meaning didn't. I realized then that he wasn't arguing with me. He wasn't confused. He simply didn't see my contribution the way I did. To him, the company's survival wasn't fragile. It was inevitable. Strong. Protected by his name, his experience, his reputation. The fact that it had almost collapsed more than once didn't exist in his version of reality, because I had made sure he never felt it. When I tried to explain again, more carefully this time, he interrupted me, still calm, still composed. He told me ambition had a way of making people forget gratitude. He told me many people would be happy to be in my position. He told me opportunity itself was a reward. Then he stood up. The conversation was over. I walked back to my desk feeling something hollow open inside my chest. Not anger yet. Something quieter. Something heavier. Around me, the office continued as usual. Emails arrived. Phones rang. Colleagues stopped by with questions they didn't bother taking to anyone else because they knew I would handle them. I did. Automatically. Out of habit more than choice. By evening, the building had emptied. I stayed. I pulled up reports my father hadn't reviewed closely in months. Numbers that told a very different story from the one he believed. Margins thinner than they appeared. Growth held together by last-minute negotiations. Risks hidden behind confident projections. As I sat there alone, the hum of the lights the only sound left, something finally shifted. For the first time, I didn't feel proud of keeping everything together. I felt tired. I realized how much of myself I had poured into a company that saw my effort as expected, not earned. How easily years of sacrifice had been reduced to luck. How invisible my work had become because it had succeeded too quietly. I shut down my computer and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. A thought I had avoided for years surfaced without warning. What would happen if I stopped? Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just quietly. What would happen to the company if I stopped saving it before it started falling apart? That question followed me as I turned off the lights and walked out into the night, unaware that asking for a raise was only the first crack in something that had been breaking for a long time. The next morning felt different before I even reached the office. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just slightly heavier, like the air had thickened overnight. I arrived early as I usually did, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel ahead of the day. I felt behind myself. People greeted me the same way they always had. Casual smiles. Quick questions. Assumptions that I was already handling things. Nothing had changed for them. That realization stayed with me longer than it should have. I opened my inbox and saw the usual flood of emails. Issues that needed solving. Decisions that somehow always landed on my desk. I started responding out of reflex, then stopped halfway through one message and stared at the screen. I wasn't angry. I was aware. There was a difference. Later that morning, a supplier called in a panic. A shipment delay. Penalties on the line. Normally, I would have stepped in immediately, smoothed it over, promised fixes I would personally manage. Instead, I forwarded the call to my father's assistant and waited. Nothing happened. An hour passed. Then two. The supplier called again, frustration creeping into their voice. I listened this time, quietly, before telling them someone would be in touch. I could feel the tension building, like something stretched too tight. By noon, my father called me into his office. His tone was different now. Sharper. Less relaxed. He asked why the issue hadn't been handled. I told him calmly that it had been passed along. That it wasn't technically my responsibility anymore. I watched his face as he processed that sentence, as if it didn't quite fit into the version of reality he preferred. He reminded me, politely at first, that teamwork mattered. That stepping up was part of being family. I nodded and agreed without arguing. But I didn't move. The silence between us lasted longer than either of us expected. When I left his office, I felt something strange settle in my chest. Not guilt. Not fear. Relief. Over the next few days, small things began to slip. Nothing catastrophic. Just delays. Miscommunications. Decisions that took longer because they had to be discussed instead of quietly fixed. People started asking questions they'd never had to ask before. Who normally handled this? Why isn't this resolved yet? Should we escalate? The company didn't fall apart. But it slowed. And slowing revealed cracks that had been hidden for years. I noticed my father staying later than usual. Taking calls I used to handle. Asking for updates he had never asked for before. He looked tired in a way I had never seen. Less certain. One evening he stopped by my desk. "You didn't tell me things were this fragile," he said, almost accusingly. I looked at him and realized something important. He wasn't angry because the company was struggling. He was unsettled because he was feeling what I had been carrying alone for years. "I didn't want you to worry," I replied honestly. He didn't respond right away. That night, I stayed late again, but this time I wasn't fixing anything. I was observing. Watching how problems moved through the company without me intercepting them. How long it took for solutions to form. How often they didn't. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was stepping back. The guilt tried to surface. Years of conditioning told me that loyalty meant sacrifice. That being needed was proof of worth. That if I didn't step in, everything would collapse and it would be my fault. But another voice had started speaking too. A quieter one. It asked why the company deserved my silence more than I deserved respect. At home that night, I couldn't sleep. My father's words echoed in my mind. Lucky. Grateful. Opportunity. All words that sounded generous until you realized they were being used to excuse imbalance. I thought about the years I had postponed my own growth. The offers I had turned down. The skills I had built but never marketed because I was too busy keeping someone else's legacy intact. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by saving something that refused to acknowledge me. The next morning, I made a decision. I updated my resume. Quietly. Carefully. Without telling anyone. It felt disloyal. It also felt necessary. By the end of the week, interviews were scheduled. Conversations I hadn't had in years. People asking about my experience with genuine interest. Listening when I spoke. Each call felt like air returning to my lungs. At the office, tension grew. My father noticed the distance now. The hesitation. The fact that I was no longer anticipating his needs before he expressed them. One evening, he asked me directly if something was wrong. I told him the truth. I said I felt invisible. I said I couldn't keep carrying the weight without recognition. I said being told I was lucky had changed how I saw everything. For the first time, he didn't dismiss it immediately. He looked unsettled. But uncertainty didn't mean understanding. And I realized then that clarity doesn't always come before consequence. Sometimes it comes because of it. The change didn't happen all at once. It never does. It arrived quietly, disguised as tension in meetings, as longer pauses before decisions, as my father rereading emails he once skimmed with confidence. I could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened when problems surfaced, problems that used to disappear before they ever reached him. For years, I had been the filter between reality and his comfort. Now reality was reaching him directly. One afternoon, a client walked into his office unannounced. Not angry. Worse, concerned. They asked questions my father didn't have answers to. Timelines. Guarantees. Contingencies. I watched from my desk as the door closed, as voices rose and then fell into something quieter and more serious. When the client left, my father didn't come out for a long time. That evening he asked me to stay. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a request. We sat across from each other in the same office where he had called me lucky. The award still hung on the walls. His name still filled the frames. But something in the room felt different now. Less certain. Less protected. He asked me how long things had been this close to falling apart. I told him the truth. I told him about the nights I stayed late rewriting plans. About the deals that survived only because I promised things we barely managed to deliver. About the stress I carried quietly because I believed that was what loyalty looked like. I didn't accuse him. I didn't raise my voice. I just spoke plainly the way I had wanted to weeks ago. He listened. Really listened. And for the first time he didn't interrupt. When I finished, he leaned forward, elbows on the desk, hands clasped the way mine had been during our first conversation. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. I didn't know, he said quietly. I believed him. That didn't make it hurt less. He admitted that he had taken stability for granted. That he had assumed the company was strong because it always had been. That seeing the cracks now scared him more than he wanted to admit. His voice softened when he said he never meant to make me feel invisible. Intent didn't erase impact. I told him I had started looking elsewhere. That I had interviews lined up. That staying without recognition wasn't an option anymore. The words felt heavy but honest. Necessary. For a moment, I thought he might get angry. Defensive. Dismissive. Instead, he nodded slowly. He told me he didn't want to lose me. Not as an employee. Not as a partner. Not as his child. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He apologized. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. But sincerely. He acknowledged that calling me lucky had been unfair. That it had minimized everything I had given. That he had confused gratitude with silence, and loyalty with endurance. He said the company needed me. Not just my labor, but my voice. I didn't accept immediately. Trust doesn't rebuild itself in one conversation. We talked for hours that night. About structure. About transparency. About boundaries that should have existed years ago. About what it would take for me to stay. Not emotionally, but professionally. The raise came first. Fair. Overdue. Then something more important followed. Authority. My role was formalized. Decisions I had been making quietly were now mine openly. Responsibility came with recognition, not expectation disguised as opportunity. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't instant. But it was real. Weeks later, I declined the other offers. Not because they weren't good, but because I finally felt seen where I was. Not lucky. Earned. The company stabilized again, this time honestly. With shared weight. With conversations instead of assumptions. My father changed too, slowly, awkwardly, learning to ask instead of expect. One evening, as we locked up together, he paused at the door and looked at me. I should have said this sooner, he admitted. You didn't just keep the company alive. You carried it. I nodded. That was enough. Because the real victory wasn't the raise or the title or the apology. It was knowing that I no longer had to disappear to keep something standing, and that luck had nothing to do with any of it.